he's actually pretty much the foremost when it comes to environmental research. He's done so much work on climate change.
Okay, well, it's great to be here this afternoon. Two great preceding talks to sort of set the stage for this. And I'm going to talk here today about sustainable consumption and local public finance, which sounds like a decidedly unsexy topic. But it springs out of a conversation that Helena and I have been having for probably the better portion of the past year or so, about the relationship between carbon footprint and income, and how to sort of engage with that in a meaningful policy way. It also traces back to some work that's gone on for the last couple of years. It's been led by Babe O'Sullivan, who's sitting down in the front here next to Helena, who's been heading up a project under the auspices of the Urban Sustainability Directors Network in North America, in looking at sort of practical tools that urban sustainability managers could begin to implement as a means of meeting climate action goals and reducing, addressing climate change issues at the local level that don't require interventions by higher orders of governance, but are within the remit of local city councils and mayors and so forth. So this is about how we can look at the property tax and the role that it's presently serving in encouraging some of this residential upsizing that Kevin and Helena addressed, and perhaps how the property tax could be reconfigured in a way that would help us to more successfully meet sustainability objectives. So there's been, since the financial crisis, 2007, 2008, a growing attention within the sustainable consumption research community on the role of finance in its multifaceted manifestations. Most of that attention thus far has been on the role of investment banking and hedge funds and the movement of money through global circuits, which is obviously important and has become a subject of ongoing attention and research. But I think it's also important to recognize that the finance industry is not just about the movement of money through global circuits, that there are much more mundane aspects of the financial industry, and in particular, the way in which local communities, and this is a talk that's focused primarily on the U.S., and all countries have their own idiosyncratic ways for assessing and collecting property taxes. So this is about the U.S. context, but I'll leave it all to each of you to sort of extrapolate from what I'm saying into the property tax regime that exists in places that you're each personally familiar with. So local property tax is imposed virtually across the United States, and it's the way in which most communities pay for their sewers and their schools and their police departments and their fire departments and other local community services. The current property tax system in the United States, and from what I've come to understand, it's fairly universal across OECD countries. The current property tax system is first of all massively out of sync with sustainability. That in fact it's the obverse, that the way in which, and I'll explain this in a few minutes, the way in which the property tax system operates in fact encourages this kind of construction activity and incentivizes especially wealthy households to build outsized homes for themselves. Another important point, I think, is to recognize that there is a well-institutionalized and established structure for collecting property taxes. And that this is not about, the creation of exotic new financial instruments and derivatives, or even the creation of new carbon markets. That every community in the United States has a tax collector, and people are sort of accustomed to, on a regular monthly, quarterly, annual basis, paying property tax. Third point is that, I'll talk more about this in a second, the United States and to varying degrees in other countries, the taxation of real property is the primary source of revenue for financing municipal services, as I indicate, and it's pretty easy to calculate. You have the assessed value of the property, you have a tax rate, and that generates what your annual tax bill is going to be. Kevin made reference to this as well. One of the advantages of taxing property, particularly real estate, as opposed to taxing income, is that you can't hide property in an offshore account. It can be seen, it can be assessed, it's visible, and it's a tax that is very, very difficult for people to evade. And also backing that up is the fact that in the United States, local governments have extremely extensive powers in being able to appropriate real estate for which property tax has not been paid on. Local government can come in after a relatively short period of time. So a house that's been in arrears for, maybe only a year or two. The local government can come in, seize that property, and auction it off, and recover the unpaid taxes that are owned on it. So the risk of forfeiture is very high, and that serves as a pretty strong incentive to encourage people to keep current on their property taxes. So first important lesson to learn, and the Americans in the audience, and probably others are already familiar with this, because you get a tax bill on a regular basis from your local municipal government, is that property tax is assessed on a flat tax basis. So regardless of the value of your property, whether you own a home that's $250,000 or a house that's worth $500,000 or a house that has an assessed value of $1 million, all homeowners are paying tax at the same rate. Now, of course, the owner of $1 million house is going to have a higher tax bill than the owner of a $250,000 home, but the rate is consistent across all property values. And in fact, as I'll talk about in a second, is that the property tax has been long recognized as being very seriously regressive, because the lower value homeowner is typically paying a higher proportion of their income in property tax than the wealthier homeowner is. So the property tax has long been a subject of consideration for progressive reform because of its extreme regressivity. As well as so there's a social sustainability problem associated with the property tax and the way in which the property tax has long been implemented. There's also an environmental sustainability problem, because a flat tax implicitly encourages and creates this tendency to encourage residential upsizing, because as your income increases, the incidence of the tax declines. And so you saw that prominent tail in Kevin's slide of people at the very, very far extreme, because it doesn't matter what the property tax is. It's in no way discouraging them from building and occupying larger residencies, and in fact, it's in serving as an implicit inducement to do so. So the question then becomes, how do we turn the property tax into a tool that facilitates sustainable consumption, that suppresses the desire for residential upsizing, and provides a mechanism that local governments could, if they were politically disposed to doing so, could implement tomorrow? Or maybe not tomorrow, but at least next year or in the not so distant future. So that requires a shift from a flat tax rate to a graduated tax rate that, as you move from relatively lower value property that has pays a tax rate of, in this example, of 2%, to a modest or more moderately priced home of, say, $500,000, is paying now a stepped up rate of, rather than 2%, 3%. And then as you get into the higher reaches of the local real estate options, a home that's valued at $1 million is paying 4%. So you have here a multiplicative effect that the higher income or higher valued homes are paying not just a higher amount, but they're paying a higher percentage. So it's escalating as we move into higher price ranges. So there's actually an interesting history about graduated property taxation. During the early decades of the 19th century, there were extensive debates here in British Parliament over the implementation of a graduated property tax that didn't actually come to be implemented in any kind of recognizable form. But in New Zealand, during the latter part of the 19th century, early decade of the 20th century, one of the big concerns was the aggregation of relatively smaller farm holdings into larger and larger estates. And the New Zealand government, over this period of time, experimented extensively with various types of graduated property taxation as a means of discouraging that activity. Quite interesting, in the United States, in the American state of North Dakota, located out here in the northern plains, in 1950, there was a statewide referendum. So everyone in the state was asked to vote on a public question of whether they wanted the state to have the ability, the authority to delegate responsibility to individual localities to raise property taxes on the basis of a graduated tax. That vote did not win the day, the most recent, or one of the more recent examples of a graduated property tax being implemented is in the case of the city-state of Singapore. So Singapore, as some of you know, is a place that attracts large amounts of foreign investment, especially for upper-end luxury apartments. And one of the ways that the Singaporean government has sought to dampen that demand has been by implementing a fairly steep, stepwise property tax. Another example, a couple of years ago in the state of Minnesota, located over here. Minnesota tried to implement this in a slightly different way, because instead of graduating the tax rate as you moved up to higher value properties, what they tried to do instead was to provide the owners of lower value properties with a rebate, which was deemed to be much more politically feasible than raising tax rates on the wealthiest property owners. That too did not. It actually passed in one body of the state legislature, and then it died before action was taken by the other body. The governor of the state never had to weigh in. In a small town in western Massachusetts, place by the name called Great Barrington, located over here. It's a sort of a tourist town in western Massachusetts. Has a history of sort of leftward-leaning progressive politics. There was a community initiative just last year of trying to implement a graduated property tax, but it failed there as well, at least for the moment. But just to sort of survey the scene, to give you a sort of a comprehensive view of how this idea has been percolating around in different places and sometimes for different purposes. The preceding government in Hungary, before the rise of the current populist government, implemented a graduated property tax in 2009. The Orban government came to power in 2010. One of the first things they did was to wipe the slate clean and get rid of it. But it did last long enough that the first installment of tax payments on this basis was collected in this way. Cyprus has also looked at at a graduated property tax as a form of tax reform. And then also, interestingly, in Canada, one of the major public employee unions has sort of staked out some ground around a graduated property tax as a form of policy reform. So let me just, in sort of bringing this to a close, let me just sort of highlight the fact that what I've described here today is kind of the cleanest version of a graduated property tax. But there's a couple of other ways to achieve the same objective in ways that might not be as politically intractable or politically difficult to implement. Borrowing from the Minnesota example that I explained before, rather than adjusting the tax rates at the upper end, another way of achieving a similar political or policy objective is to provide people with, at the lower end, with a subsidy or an abatement. And a third way is to provide people with a rebate on taxes that they've already paid. So rather than adjusting your tax due on a pre-tax basis, you could adjust it at the back end in the form of a rebate. And then there's another option of just simply imposing a luxury tax as a supplementary tax on the front end, on the back end as well. So we can sort of slice and dice these in various different ways. A couple of our general observations is that if you're in the upper part of this typology, if you're in the upper part of this typology, some of the sort of characteristics that you're working within is an option that affords a better sustainability alternative, because not only do you have capacity to suppress residential upsizing, you also have the potential to generate an investment fund that can be utilized for other sustainability enhancing purposes. And then down here, one of the advantages is that it may be politically more feasible, but it's going to be more costly, because you're going to need to find some other source of revenue to offset the rebates that you're providing to lower income, lower value property owners. Again, we can sort of look at some of the characteristics if we divide it on the basis of whether the tax or whether the program is implemented on a pre-tax or a post-tax basis. If you do it on a pre-tax basis, your pre-tax adjustments are likely to become more successfully institutionalized. What we see in the case of programs that are organized on the basis of refunds, that those can quite easily and readily disappear as the direction of the political winds changes. So let me just sort of make a couple of very quick summarizing points. I think first of all, and this sort of comes out I think over the last 2.5 days of discussion at this conference, we need to challenge the neoliberal red herring that it's not the role of governments to influence individual or household consumption decisions. The use of land use controls and taxation policies are unavoidably, and in many cases purposefully, used to shape consumption decisions and consumption patterns. That was indicated in the sort of short thumbnail sketch that Helena gave earlier on about the sort of history of consumption stimulation efforts in the U.S. and elsewhere. Second point, the onset of climate change, particularly in coastal communities, may create imperatives for owners of higher value properties to impose tax premiums on themselves to pay for armoring investments. And this may be a bit of the sort of argument we had in one of the earlier sessions today about Trojan horses, whereby wealthier homeowners become impelled almost to ask the government to tax them at a higher rate in order to protect themselves from regular inundation. Third point, it's difficult to implement a graduated property tax on an entirely localized basis because of the potential of residents to exercise a flight option. So your local government imposes a graduated property tax, you say, oh, the hell with it, I'm going to move to the town next door. But there are obviously obstacles to being able to do that, but I think overall it's probably better to be able to do this as a regional strategy where communities in a particular demarcated area decide that they're going to do this all together. But obviously getting everybody on board and agreeable to do that is going to be a challenge. Fourth point, I think it's better to operationalize a graduated property tax on the basis of fairness and housing affordability than on the basis of sustainable consumption. And this gets into some of the issues that Philip's been looking at, in terms of how we more effectively communicate sustainable consumption. That there are ways of talking about this in ways that don't require reference whatsoever to sustainable consumption, but to other political ideals that carry some weight in many communities. Just two more. Graduated property tax is likely to be more effective as a tool with which to suppress residential upsizing in urban areas, i.e. the Singapore example, than in controlling consolidation of large rural land holdings, which is the historical basis of this idea as it developed during the 19th and first half of the 20th century. And then finally, and I guess this sort of becomes obvious as well, is that the property tax question is really just one relatively narrow slice of the larger problematique, and that the reform of property tax needs to be pursued in conjunction with an overhaul of other systems of public finance, and particularly with efforts in many countries to reestablish the strong progressivity of the income tax. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully have a chance for some discussion.